The smaller seeming decisions in your story can have a big impact. Which tense you choose is one of those decisions. So today I want to talk about past versus present. Which tense is best in creative writing? As authors, we usually just start writing, and whichever tense comes out, past or present, is the one we stick with. But sometimes we should put a little bit more thought into it. Instead, we should pause sometime in the beginning of writing our story to make sure we've chosen the correct tense. If we haven't, we're going to have to do quite a bit of rewriting. One thing that will help you determine your tense is the point of view. So at the end of this video, I'm going to share with you a point of view comparison chart. This is Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers, because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and writer. Let's start with, what is tense in creative writing? Tense in creative writing refers to the ending of a verb that lets a reader know when that action took place. Is it happening right now? Did it already happen? Will it happen in the future? I think this is best understood through some examples. Eva jumped over the creek. See the ed at the end of jumped? That means this is past tense. Past tense is when the action has already occurred. Eva jumps over the creek. See how that doesn't have the ed, instead it has an s? That means this is present tense. Present tense is when the action is happening right now. Eva will jump over the creek. Now jump doesn't have an s or an ed, and we've added the word will. That means this is future tense. Future tense is when the action hasn't happened yet. In creative writing, future tense is rarely used, so we're going to focus on past and present tenses. There are subcategories of tenses, such as past perfect. A good, quick definition and examples of those can be found at A Guide to Verb Tenses, 5 Tips for Using Tenses Correctly, which I have linked to in the notes under this video. Regardless of which tense you choose to use, the most important thing is that you are consistent. You shouldn't be switching back and forth between tenses frequently. That's confusing to a reader. They don't know what's happening now, what's happening then, or why you are doing that. You should only switch tenses if you have a pretty good reason for that. For example, if you're pulling the story into the present, or if you're writing in present tense and you have a flashback, that flashback's not happening right now, so it should be in past tense. When you do switch tenses, it needs to be clear when that switch has occurred and that a switch has occurred. Scene breaks are a great way to do this. If you have a tendency of switching tenses while you're writing, you're going to need to do a couple of passes through your manuscript where all you do is double check your tenses and correct any of those slip-ups. Now that we've covered what is tense in creative writing, let's talk about how present tense affects your story. When you write in present tense, your reader is going to notice. They're going to notice your tense. Maybe this is because traditionally stories are told in past tense. Maybe it's some other reason altogether. Either way, it's not very common that we have someone who's going along telling what's happening as it's happening, which is what you're doing when you write in present tense. That's rare, so it might be one of the reasons we notice when a story is told in present tense. Even when we're telling our friends a story, usually we use past tense. So in our daily lives as well as in creative writing, past tense is more common. Now there are a few real-life situations when we do use present tense. Think of some of those Twitter threads where someone is relating an event as it's happening. Maybe it's something happening in a cafe or on an airplane. They use present tense then. Also, sports announcers. They're relating the game as it's happening in real time, so present tense is the best choice. Present tense adds to a story's urgency and tension, and it can increase the pace. The 2 points of view where present tense is the most common is first person and second person. Even though present tense is used more commonly in first person than in third or omniscient, it's still not very common. First person present tense means that you have a character who is narrating their own story as it's happening. It takes a very special person to walk around doing that. They're either super arrogant or narcissistic, maybe they're really flustered, maybe they're worried if they don't get it out now, they won't be able to in the future. So it requires a specific personality or situation to make a character relate their story in real time. But sometimes it is the best choice. That's the case for Carolyn Pignet's Shooter. Here's an excerpt. Nerd girl finally shuts up, but she's still swaying a bit as she backs up to the door. So, I'm gonna go now, she mutters. I really should get to class. What are you talking about? Izzy looks at her like she's crazy. Hello, we're in a lockdown. Lockdown? Nerd girl frowns. I guess she hit her head harder than I thought. Shooter is a Breakfast Club meets school shooting type of story. We have a small group of characters who are locked in a bathroom together during a school shooting. Using present tense mimics the craziness of the situation that the characters find themselves in. It mimics that urgency and feeling of being flustered. It's frantic, and the characters are feeling frantic for much of the story. Present tense also means, as a reader, we don't know who is going to make it out alive and who isn't. Maybe they all will, maybe none of them will. But since the story is being told in real time, we don't know. That's why it's a good choice for this story in particular. It fits the situation. So even though first-person present tense is used, it's not used more frequently than first-person past tense. That's not the case for second person. Second person is the only point of view that is by far more likely to be in present tense. That's because in second person, the character is the reader. They don't know what they've already done. They're experiencing the story as you're telling it, as they're reading it. So when you use second person present tense, you're telling the reader what they're doing as you go along in real time. This makes more sense for that point of view. Here's an example of what that looks like from Leslie Harrison's With a Cherry on Top, a short story from Flight, a 30th Street fiction anthology. You're perched at the top of your contraption, your steely roundness nestled in a small hole carved into a disposable wooden ice cream spoon. The drone of the crowd echoes around you. The girl told you the gymnasium would be big, bigger than the barn you practice in, and she warned you the room would be full of people. Still, you weren't prepared for the rows and rows of strangers, in different sizes like the Russian dolls the girls play with. In this story, a reader gets to experience what it's like to be an object in a competition. They get to live the race as it happens. That's why present tense works so well. The reader is the character experiencing the race in real time. Unlike past tense, present tense is the most effective when you're using it for a reason. It's not really a great fallback tense. So if you find yourself using present tense, ask yourself why. What is it doing to your story? What is it about your story that requires that tense? If you don't have a reason, maybe consider switching to past tense instead. Again, readers notice present tense. It sticks out. It makes them pay attention to the tense of your verbs. We don't always want that. Usually, we want the reader to pay more attention to other aspects of our story, like our characters or descriptions. So use present tense when you have a reason. Now let's talk about how past tense affects your story. Past tense is the traditional fallback tense, because this is how we usually tell our stories. If I go home and tell my roommate something that happened to me today, I'm not going to tell her that story in present tense. I'm going to tell her the story in past tense because it already happened. As humans, we usually tell stories after they're finished. Past tense also disappears. It's kind of like said in dialogue. Readers register that a story is in past tense, but they don't focus on that. The use of past tense frees them up to focus on a different aspect of your story. Third person and omniscient points of view use past tense almost exclusively. Like in all areas of creative writing, there are exceptions, but they're rare. Third person and omniscient just tend to work better in past tense. So unless you have a really good reason for present tense, if you're writing in third person or omniscient, you should probably be using past tense. Here's an example of what that looks like from Denver City Justice by J.V.L. Bell. Total mayhem followed the sheriff's announcement. Men bounded to their feet, knocking over chairs as they pushed and shoved toward the food table. Mr. Poor collided with old Shakespeare, and the short shopkeeper stumbled and landed in Widow Ferris's lap. Denver City Justice is an 1800s murder mystery set in Colorado. The author, Bell, would rather have her readers focus on the mayhem and chaos that's happening, not the tense that she's using to execute her story. Now notice, even though this is in past tense, there's still tension, it still has a fast pace, things are still happening. So you can increase your pace and create tension even without using present tense. First person is also usually told in past tense, but it's not as close to being exclusively in past tense as third person and omniscient, as we saw in the previous example. Normally, like I said, we tell a story after it's happened. The same thing goes for your first person character narrators. If your character is telling a story, they're probably reporting it after the fact. They could be writing it down in a diary, they could be being interviewed by someone and telling it then, or they could be speaking directly to the reader to tell their story. Either way, they're probably still telling it after the fact. So here's an example of what that looks like. From M.H. Borison's The Girl with Ghost Eyes. I took it slow. Moving back into my body, the 12 pulses would grow quicker. The breath would grow deeper. I relaxed into myself again, feeling the cords of my spirit realign with muscles and sinews. It was a wonderful feeling, a homecoming. So that's what past tense looks like in first person. It's still clear which tense is being used. It's still easy to understand what's happening. There can, again, still be urgency, but we don't see it as much in this passage. This is more of a relief passage. When it comes to tenses, using past tense frees you up to experiment with other aspects of writing. So if you are playing with form or doing something else different, using past tense is probably going to help you because the tense is going to disappear, the readers are going to focus on whatever you're playing with instead. Again, past tense is a good fallback, but use present tense if you do have a good reason. Next, I want to share an editor and author's suggestions for choosing your tense. The other reason I want you to think about your tenses is it can be the difference between getting traditionally published and not. A few years ago, people suddenly started writing in first-person present tense a lot. Up until then, it was fairly rare. And most of the people who were suddenly writing in first-person present tense were new debut authors. That means that combination became the mark of an amateur writer. Now, this has definitely lessened with time, but there's still a little bit of a stigma in the publishing world. If you're a new author and you're pitching a first-person present tense story, you're going to have a little bit of a harder time finding an agent and publisher than someone who is pitching a first-person past tense story. So think about that when you are choosing the tense of your piece. Now again, this is not nearly as bad as it used to be, but there is still a little bit of a stigma. Some agents and acquiring editors do still have a bias against this point of view and tense combination. The other thing I want you to think about when you're considering the tense for your story and you're looking into revisions is this really the hill you want to die on? In my experience, authors get weirdly stubborn about the tense that they're choosing to use. In the scheme of things, this really doesn't have that huge of an effect on your story. I think you'd be more stubborn if I said, this character makes no sense, you should cut them completely. But sometimes people care more about the tense than they do their character. Then I want you to sit back and think, Do you really care that much about the tense, or do you just not want to put in the work to fix it? Usually I've found that's the reason the authors I work with are so stubborn about their tense. They know it's going to be a lot of work to go back and revise to either fix their tenses to make them consistent or to switch tenses. I know it's a lot of work. I've done this for authors, and I've done this for some of my own writing when I've decided I didn't like the original tense. Yes, it takes time. Yes, it takes some energy, but it's also worth it, and it's a fairly simple revision. It's not like you have to create whole new scenes in order to do this. But that's also why I recommend that you pause at some point when you're starting your first draft to double check your tenses. Think about where your story's going, think about the characters and your narrators, and choose your tense accordingly, instead of just starting writing and sticking with whatever you started with all the way to the end of your book's first draft. It's much easier to go back and fix a few chapters than it is to have to redo the whole thing. Also, bad reviews can come from tense. One of the things that can kill a book is bad copy editing, bad proofreading. If readers find too many errors in the beginning of your book, they're really not going to be happy. Tense is one thing that can be seen as an error. If you keep switching back and forth between past and present tense, a reader is going to notice. That's going to lead to a bad review. So even if you have chosen a tense, you need to go back and make sure that you're consistent. So which tense is your default? I'm curious. Do you tend to start writing in past tense or present? Share your tendencies in the comments below. And for more videos on writing mechanics and other aspects of writing, subscribe to Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers. Because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and writer. To find out more about me, go to www.ignitedinkwriting.com. That's where you will find your point of view comparison chart. If you know what point of view you're going to use, it'll help you figure out your tense. You will also find that chart linked in the description below. And now it's your turn to decide which tense, past or present, is the best one for your story to ignite your ink.